Well, welcome back to In the Word, and welcome back to the book of Jeremiah. We'll be in Jeremiah chapter 2 today. But before we get there, let me just comment, a real disturbing trend that's being reported within the church among God's professing people is a neglect of God's Word. When we neglect God's Word, we cut ourselves off from His guidance and His help and His love for us and His power. And we also open ourselves up to being misled, and all kinds of apostasy and false teaching comes into the church, and we become victims because we are not in God's Word. Of course, the ministry of In the Word is to try to reverse that trend and try to get people to be spending time in the Word. So I'd really encourage you to buck this trend that seems to be happening in the church by not only being in the Word yourself, but maybe telling your friends, church family about In the Word. Get them to subscribe and be in the Word on a daily basis. Perhaps you could be the catalyst to put together a study group to discuss these videos every day, or discuss them maybe once a week and reflect on what the Lord is teaching you in these things. Jeremiah is prophesying at the end of the reign of King Josiah. In Josiah's reign, the book of the law was rediscovered, and it led to a revival in Jerusalem and Judea. The rediscovery and the commitment to God's word always leads to revival, even in the church. It always has and always will. So perhaps you could be a conduit, an instrument, a tool that brings revival to your own group of friends or to your own church, and see what the Lord would do by reading and honoring His Word. So that being said, let's go back to the book of Jeremiah, back to chapter 2. I called chapter 2 the indictment of Judah. It's really the beginning of a long section of indictment that runs from chapter 2 to verse 24. We also see in this section really the God who is instructing. So in this indictment, He's also teaching. So we need to pay attention to what God is teaching us here. It's kind of a long chapter in my Bible. It's like 3 pages, 37 verses. So we'll divide this up into bite-sized pieces. I call this Judah's unfaithfulness. They're being indicted for their unfaithfulness. Really goes from chapter 2 to the first part of chapter 3 verse 5 to be exact. But verses 1 through 3 in this chapter really recount Judah's good start, the good start of the nation. God is remembering remembering the devotion of their youth is what He says here, how He loved them, not they loved Him. And they followed Him in the wilderness and depended on Him. But then in verse 4 and through verses 4 through 9, we see a shift. We see a change. It says, what wrong did your fathers find in me that they went far from me? So suddenly, after following the Lord through the wilderness, the fathers, the leaders of the nation, begin to neglect God. And that has an effect on the whole nation, on the priests and the shepherds as well. They begin to neglect Him. And as we look in the Bible, we see when God's word is neglected, when people don't pay attention to Him, they begin a long slide into both spiritual mediocrity and idolatry. So the Lord confronts them and indicts them on this. Notice the wording here. He says, what wrong did your fathers find in me that they went far from me and went after worthlessness and became worthless? We are what we worship. Have you noticed that? If we are devoted to the Lord, if we are devoted to the Father, Son, and Spirit, we find ourselves being conformed into the image of His Son. If we devote ourselves to worthless things, we see our character begin to fall apart, our spiritual strength begin to ebb. And that's what He's warning about here. They went after worthlessness and became worthless. Look at verse 8. The priests did not say, where is the Lord? The shepherds transgressed. The prophets prophesied by Baal and went after things that do not profit. So we see this wholesale slide into spiritual mediocrity, or simply in verses 4 through 9 in my Bible, I labeled those neglect. This leads to verse 10 and verses 10 through 13 about coming judgment. It says, "Therefore I will contend with you, declares the Lord, and with your children's children I will contend." So a argument is set up here, a fight that God is going to make against Israel and their children. And he says at the end of verse 11, "But my people have changed their glory for that which is not profit." So what's he talking about here? They changed their glory. Well, he points them to the other nations and say, look how these other nations are faithful to their gods, even though they're not gods at all. But you've exchanged me, the glory of Israel. You've exchanged me for a false god. And that's just incredible. They're doing things that even the pagan nations around them don't do. So as a result, he says, be appalled. And look, he calls the heavens. Be appalled, O heavens, at this. Be shocked, be utterly desolate, declares the Lord. He's calling the heavens to be a witness, as if he puts them in the jury box in a trial. He brings his case against Israel, and he calls on the jury, the heavens. I think in this case he's calling on the angelic beings to be witnesses against Israel, how they have slidden away from the Lord. They've done things that even pagan nations don't do. They've traded in their gods. For my people committed two evils, he goes on to say. The first one is they have forsaken me. The second, they hewed out cisterns for themselves. So the metaphor on the cistern here is that they have a cistern is a tank that collects fresh water from rain or runoff that's going to be able to refresh you and sustain life later. By hewing out their own cisterns, they've sought the source of life and refreshment in other places rather than God. And they're indicted for that. They are brought to trial and indicted. And now comes the judgment. Verses 14 through 19 is a warning about a coming humiliation. He calls them servants. He says they turned into prey. Their land is a waste in accordance with what Deuteronomy 28 verses 4 through 62 talks about, the land being devastated as punishment. The crowns of their heads are shaved. This is what would happen to prisoners who went into captivity. So he's warning them that this is going to happen to them. Look at verses 18, where he talks about going to Egypt to drink the waters of the Nile, going to Nineveh to drink the waters of the Euphrates. What he's referring to here, what the Lord is speaking about, is the northern and southern borders of the land that he had promised to Israel. And rather than turn to the Lord to secure those borders, rather than rely on him to keep them secure in those borders, they instead try to make alliances with Egypt and Assyria. And this is going to end in disaster with the coming devastation brought by Babylon. In verse 20, we begin a section in Jeremiah that he uses a common metaphor to describe Israel's apostasy, Judah's apostasy. He likens them to wives that have gone astray, or even camels or donkeys that are in heat and run after other lovers, Very graphic language, very stark language, expresses how God feels about the apostasy that comes upon Israel, and later even the apostasy that comes upon the church. So we see that here in verses 20 to 22. He says, I planted you a choice vine, wholly of pure seed, then you have turned degenerate and have become a wild vine. In fact, to such a degree, it says in verse 22, that even if you wash yourself with lye and use much soap, the stain of your guilt is still before me. So again, what's going on here is the Lord is saying that you are so degenerate in your worship that there is no solution, that you're going to be turned over to severe chastening by the Babylonians. Only judgment is left. Verses 23 through 25 then use this imagery of spiritual promiscuity. Look at your way in the valley. Know what you have done. A restless young camel running here and there, a wild donkey used to the wilderness, in her heat sniffing the wind, who can restrain her lust? Again, just very graphic language here to describe God's people sniffing into the air and running after this God and that God, whatever God they think is going to give them safety or security or give them great crops. And they don't turn to the God who has promised them all these things, the God who has formed them into a nation, the God has brought them into the land, the God that promises them blessing. They turn to every other God except Him. In fact, verses 26 through 28 that say that they steal the affection that is due God and give it to another. It says, as a thief is shamed when caught, so the house of Israel will be shamed. And what are they going to be shamed about? Verse 27, they'd say to a tree, you're my father. To a stone, you gave us birth. This is, of course, referencing idolatry. That they're giving their paternity, they're giving their birth credit to idols rather than to the Lord Himself, who formed them out of a nation of Abraham. So in the time of their trouble, they say, arise and save us. But where are your gods that you have made for yourself? So he's calling them to make a decision. When you get in trouble, you call on these so-called gods, but do they help you? Of course they don't. Verse 29 through 32 then talks about how they've ignored God. He says they struck your children. They took no correction. So God is sending prophet after prophet after prophet to them to warn them, to call them back to faithfulness, but they refuse to listen. They refuse to turn. Again, the only thing left is severe chastisement at this point. The chapter ends with a discussion of the coming shame that's going to come upon them in verses 33 through 37. Notice he says in verse 33, how well you direct your course to seek love, so that even to wicked women you have taught your ways. Your skirts has found the lifeblood of the guiltless poor, and you will not find them breaking in. Yet in spite of all these things, I say to you, you say, I am innocent. So here they are going after other gods, taking advantage of the poor, even though they're innocent. And then they claim their own innocence. How God ends this chapter then. From it too you will come away with your hands on your head, for the Lord has rejected you and rejected those in whom you trust, and you shall not prosper by them. Verse 36 says, you shall be put to shame by Egypt, as you were put to shame by Assyria. So where they put their trust, where they put their hope in these alliances with foreign countries, worshiping their gods, accepting their gods as their own, are not going to save them. So chapter 2 ends with this indictment that God is bringing against His people for starting well, but then sliding into spiritual mediocrity. And as a result, there's coming judgment, humiliation, and shame that's coming upon them. Brothers and sisters, Hebrews 13, verse 5 tells us that we too are corrected by a loving Father. He uses reproof, and He uses chastening, severe scourging in our lives. It's really up to us. My prayer for you and for me is that we would heed the reproof of the Lord, heed his word, and not force him to bring severe chastening into our lives. God bless you, brothers and sisters, as we go through the book of Jeremiah.